Welcome back to the Life on Books podcast. Today we're answering the very difficult question, what is postmodern literature? I've heard it's been compared to nailing Jell-O to a wall. And joining us today is Seth, who is actually upside down right now because he's in Australia. He's also in the future. It is Sunday where he is, and we are recording this on Saturday night. Andy is also joining us, aka Metafictional Meathead, as usual, but today from 2012, or at least the audio and video interface that he chose to use for this exhibition is from that date. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Start your engines.
Thanks for having us.
So, Seth, for those who aren't familiar with you and your literary prowess, I kind of consider you the king of the lit bros. So
Wow.
You can give your own 2-minute bio or whatever, but I want to preface this with, I've told the story of how I started the Life on Books Instagram. It was from Andy accumulating 1,000 followers on Instagram. And I was like, I've never heard of a single book that Andy has, the books he's been reading, I haven't heard of a single one of them. And I thought, if this guy could accumulate 1,000 followers on Instagram, which I thought was a bajillion at the time, by talking about these very weird books, then so there might be something to this, it might be worth pursuing. And then I stumbled upon your account, and you had like 5,000, and you were talking about even more strange books. And so that, you might not even know this, but was a big inspiration for me. So for a long time, I was like, I just got to get as big as Seth. He's got 5,000 followers on Instagram. This will be incredible. I'll be satisfied. That's not how the internet works, though. Apparently, you're never satisfied. However, how do you see yourself in the reading community online?
Well, thank you so much for that very simultaneously flattering and offensive introduction. King of the Lit Bros. I've got so many mixed emotions about this.
That's real backhanded.
Yeah,
it was intentional.
Yeah, I figured. Look, I'm just a person who's online and likes to chat about books. I have no formal training or education in the space. I am, at best, an attention deficit autodidact who's hopelessly addicted to caffeine. But I have found over the past few years, I've enjoyed using the kind of online spaces. So Instagram, BookTube, Book Twitter, etc. as just a place to discuss with like-minded readers such as yourselves about interesting and provocative works of art, primarily in literature, poetry, etc. So don't want to position myself as any formal authority, but I appreciate and definitely am flattered that you found the feed inspirational, and hope I could do the same for some other people.
Well, I first want to say I'm relieved to hear that you have no formal education, because as two chuckleheads, we hate to have anyone come and upstage us with any type of credibility whatsoever. So you fit right in with us, because Andy and I both are just a couple of mouth breathers, but
Couple of meatheads.
But you are, I would consider you a fairly well-read person. You're extremely articulate in the reviews that you do of the works that you read. And the works that you read, at least since I've known you, definitely trend towards the more experimental, certainly more obscure. Can you just give us a little bit of a history on when you really got into reading, what your kind of reading life has been like, and how you got to this point of reading some of these more interesting works?
I mean, really, it's been a, call it organic or rhizomatic process of following one node to the next, in terms of you find something and then you try to chase or, follow that chain of influence back to where that thing came from. And you follow those links back, and eventually you kind of branch outward and find some sort of a niche that you're into. So I've been sort of doing this for the past, 5-6 years. I have to disagree with you. I don't consider myself nearly as well read as I would like to be, but I think, most people who read a fair bit probably feel the same way. So
Sure.
Don't think I'm alone in that feeling. And really, it's going to come as no surprise. And how many minutes in are we, by the way, before I mention Thomas Pynchon here?
I guess technically 8, but there was a lot of
Probably 5, yeah.
Yeah, there we
for
go.
the people that are watching this on replay, it'll probably be like 3, yeah.
Fantastic.
It's okay, because apparently when Tony and I recorded last week, we made it a whole episode without mentioning him.
Are you
Yeah.
or
serious?
any of his novels. So
I think it was the first time. Yeah.
You are
Yeah.
a derelict of your duties, and you need
I
to pay
know,
some
I
penance
know.
somewhere.
Correct.
So we'll
But
we'll make up for lost time here today.
exactly.
That certainly won't be the last Thomas Pynchon mention.
Absolutely
If
not.
anyone at
considering the
home
topic
is
today.
drinking with us, take a sip now.
Fantastic. But to that point, I think it was probably about 5-6 years ago when I first had heard mention of The Crying of Lot 49. And I had never heard the name of the author before. And I just thought, interesting concept, dueling mail carriers. Let's see what that's about. And that was just sort of a real watershed moment for me to discover the capacities of what literature could do outside of my preconceived notions and expectations of what it was. And I basically thought to myself after reading that, okay, I don't know what this is, but I want more of it. And the next sort of major step in that progression was joining the Bookstagram community and curating kind of a feed of people who were like-minded and importantly, a lot of them that were better read than myself because I wanted the opinions of more seasoned readers and the perspectives and people who could offer me insights onto names I otherwise wouldn't have come across just by browsing the shelves of a local bookshop and whatnot. I mean, living in Australia, the ecosystem of book sales is very geared, obviously, toward an Australian audience and Australian authors, which is great. It's fantastic. It has its place in the world, but you don't see the same level of call it formal experimentation that I typically privilege in terms of my reading life. So I had to go through various people and, would share something that I would read, and then I'd get a DM or something like that and said, oh, you like this, you got to try this. Or, oh, you like this person? Have you heard of this person? And that's kind of just how it's gone. And it's been a couple of years of, figuring out what works, what doesn't work for me, and paring down a reasonable sense of what my personal taste is. But to be honest, it's still an ever-evolving process, and I think with each passing year, I change as a reader, which, if I may say so myself, I think that reflects pretty well with you two as well. Having followed your feeds and listened to the show since it started, it's constantly a process of growth and discovery. So,
yeah, I think, Seth, even like as time has gone on that I've followed you, like I actually Tony kind of alluded to finding the online community through me. I actually found it through you specifically after listening to the episode of Chatting Lit you did with Everyone Who Reads Must Converse on Thomas Pynchon after I had read Gravity's Rainbow, and then like you were saying, followed all those nodes, found your Instagram, found a bunch of people that you follow and engage with, started following and engaging with them, and then it just kind of spiraled from there. And like Tony was saying, like it's so many books that you were posting about at the time that I hadn't heard of and have started to get a grasp of more obscure stuff and, being more aware of these books. And now, like, I don't know half of the things you're posting about. You've been sharing stuff from, what was it, Eden, like, and all of these other authors. We, when we were discussing kind of our plans for the show, and you were listing off a ton of authors, and I was like, I haven't heard of any of these. So it's like you were saying, just a great part of that book space, being able to connect and just learn about so many new authors.
Yeah. So, I guess you could look at us as like the Holy Trinity. Seth is God.
Holy shit.
He's the Father, and Andy's maybe Jesus, and I'm the Holy Spirit. I don't know enough about my days of Catholic school are so far behind me that I don't recall the details. But to describe,
I feel like I would categorize Seth as the Holy Spirit because he's always just lingering in the background of my mind. He's always present.
Fair enough.
You
guys, and I am the oldest, so maybe I'm the father. But I digress. Previously to reading, prior to reading The Crying of Lot 49, Seth, at that point, how would you maybe describe your tastes and maybe what was like the most out there or adventurous thing you had read prior to discovering Thomas Pynchon?
Had not prepared for this question. That's interesting. I can't say I had much of a taste before that. I picked up anything that sounded interesting, and some things delivered on the promise of their blurbs and their, suggested recommendations from people. But a lot of times that thought left my head immediately. If I had to say one of the more adventurous things, I don't know if I read that adventurously prior to that. The Voyeur's Motel by Talese was quite something that I read prior to that. Have you heard that story?
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, it's wild. Guy buys a motel and basically puts peepholes in every single one of the rooms, and then he spends the next couple of decades watching the people in the rooms, and it's fully unhinged. I wouldn't call it particularly experimental or anything like that. It was just like, oh wow, that is one hell of a story.
I think that's like a real thing. I think that's actually happened though.
It's a true story. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I am familiar with that. Actually.
That's crazy.
But I didn't know there was like a book about it. So that's cool.
But to like give you an idea of how misdirected I was in those early days, I think there was a period of time where I briefly picked up Jordan Peterson's first book. So
Maps of Meaning or
no, the awful
12 Rules for Life.
Rules for Life thing. Yeah. I mean, don't get
Seth,
me wrong.
If it makes you feel any better, I have done the same. So
there we go.
You are not alone.
Brutal.
We were all young and naive once, right? Don't get me wrong. I like to make my bed as much as the next guy, but come on.
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of people joke like, "Oh, I'm so glad they didn't have social media when I was a kid." I mean, when I was in the young and impressionable phase, Jordan Peterson wasn't on the map yet, so I had a natural defense built in.
There you go.
Let's get to the matter at hand here. Postmodern literature.
Before we get to the matter at hand, Tony,
here we go.
Should we do our normal reading recap? I feel like Seth has got some good reads that he can talk about.
Sure. You know what, Seth, you don't have a hard stop, do you? Coming up on your time?
At this stage, we're okay. We're all right. Okay. Yeah, we should be fine.
Let's go for it then. Let's do a reading recap. We'll start with our guest, Seth. What have you been reading lately?
Sure. I did mention I was a little bit attention deficit beforehand, undiagnosed, but hey, that's neither here nor there. So I tend to have a few things going at once at any given time. I had prepared for the possibility that you guys were going to do a reading recap, so I've got the things that I've been reading right beside me.
Smart.
First of which is, and let's just make sure you can see that, Eden, Eden, Eden by Pierre Guyotat, translated by Graham Fox. This is basically a 150-page libidinous violent orgy, for want of a better word. Guyotat is one of those French extremists, kind of like Georges Bataille. And it's just this unbroken, basically, series of really kind of libidinous acts that occur during the Algerian War, which Guyotat was actually conscripted into. Oh, wow. And I don't really know what to make of it yet. Like, it is a piece of provocateur fiction. I'm just not sure to what end at this stage that all this, all this violence and all this sort of sexual content, what point he's trying to advance. So I'm still kind of figuring out, really what's the ethos behind the thing. But it's certainly unlike anything else I've read at this stage. It's notoriously difficult to find in print. I should mention that this is a bootleg samizdat copy that's being printed clandestinely by someone. I don't really want to put them on blast, but if someone is particularly interested in reading it, you can DM me at any of my various places online.
You're just selling it to me over and over and over and over.
You betcha. Just wait till you open it up, though. You're going to see some combination of words in there you haven't anywhere else. So,
oh boy.
That's the first one. Second one here is The Ticket That Exploded, third book in the Nova trilogy by William S. Burroughs. He's probably going to come up in discussion later on. He's got this concept of the reality studio, which is something that I think is intimately connected with what postmodernism is. And I just really love Burroughs. He's got this way of combining words and phrases that you wouldn't hear anyone else pick, kind of in a similar way that Richard Brautigan does, but to an entirely different end. And I just love what he's doing as a broader artistic project. I'm not convinced that the cut-up novels are literature so much as performance art or Dadaist experimentation, but it is something, at very least conceptually interesting. Are you familiar with the cut-up technique that Burroughs used?
I'm not.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of reasons behind why he did this, but the general premise is he would write down in a somewhat kind of continuous flow, stream of consciousness, if you will, format, but then he would literally cut up the sheets of paper that he was printing on and reorganize things. And it would create this more kind of atomized, randomized narrative flow. It's not really a flow to it at all. It's really quite chaotic to read. But it's interesting to see what he's trying to achieve with that. So that's the second thing. Then I'm reading the new selected poems and translations of Ezra Pound, and this is edited/curated by Richard Seaberth. If you have even a cursory interest in Pound, this is probably your best one-stop shop. It's got everything from his early imagism work all the way up to the cantos, up to about the rock drill cantos now, which that poem will come up in conversation later too, most likely. So
he's a pretty controversial figure too, isn't he?
Terrible person, brilliant artist. That's probably where we'll leave it for the purposes of this discussion.
Sure.
And then lastly, I've got The Pound Era by Hugh Kenner, which despite having Pound's name in it, is really just the definitive book on modernism. If you want to understand the movement and the form, this is really your one-stop shop. It is utterly brilliant. I've never felt more stupid than when I'm reading Hugh Kenner and Guy Davenport. So if you want to feel humbled as far as your intelligence is concerned, highly, highly recommended. So that's the spread of what I've got at the moment. How about you guys?
Andrew?
So I finished The Dying Grass. I don't think I had.
Finally.
I finished it last week. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we did talk about it. Yeah,
I did talk about it. So I finished The Dying Grass. I finished Hurst 07769 yesterday, which was a great. I know, Seth, you said you weren't the biggest fan of it. It wasn't your favorite Krasny-Horkai. I
Sure.
would say it probably was. It's not my favorite from him as well, but definitely a really strong novel. I thought it was very compelling. It had a lot of the same kind of themes and stylistic choices that I'd come to expect from him, and I loved it. I would put it kind of right outside of his four main novels. So that was great. I have started Butcher's Crossing, haven't gotten super deep into it. I read My Search for Warren G. Harding by, the author, Plunkett, Robert Plunkett. Again, nothing crazy there. I had heard it was a favorite of Larry David's. Not going to be my favorite book of the year, but it was a nice palate cleanser after finish, The Dying Grass. And then I had also read The Red Handler by Johann Halstad. That's an open letter publication. I cannot remember the translator off the top of my head, but that one was really fun and full of metafictional hijinks. Tony, I had told you about it, but it's a collection of 15 micro novels or short stories. And then the last half of it is they're all annotated, and it's like notes on the author's life and things like that. The collection of the micro novels is by a particular author, and then the different from Halstad, and then the annotations are about this author's life, but the author of the micro novels as well as the person that's annotating them, they're both fictitious characters. So it's just like he's written these short stories pretending to be someone else writing them, and then created another character to annotate them and kind of commentate on this character's life. So that was just a lot of fun. And then I also started Against the Day last night. So about 100 pages into that. Not in enough to have any sort of concrete opinion on it, but I will say I'm really enjoying it. And so far it's been pretty accessible as far as Pynchon goes. So good stuff.
Nice.
Just two quick questions for you regarding those reads before we get to you, Tony. What did you think of Krasny-Horkai's prose in Herrscht 07769? I thought the translation was fantastic. I just thought the actual, not so much the rhythm, but the lexical exuberance that I'd come to expect of him was more muted, more toned down in Herrscht than it was compared to something like Baron Vankheim or Schattentango or Melancholy.
I would agree. I would agree. I wasn't sure if it was more so like the I don't say the quality, but the prose, like you said, or if it was just I had become so accustomed to his style and just the 400-page sentence. But I I thought it was a lot more accessible than some of his other works. I thought, despite being 400 pages without a single real full stop, it flowed pretty well. So it didn't have the degree of difficulty that I expected. So I do think it probably was muted down. Um, definitely didn't have that same, like you said, exuberance, as I've said before, the pyrotechnical quality to it as some of his other works, but still thought it was great. But yeah, it was a little bit, like you said, muted compared to his other novels.
And yeah, the use of the word accessible, I think, is appropriately placed there. The other thing I was going to ask is what prompted you to pick up John Williams' Butcher's Crossing?
Something I was looking for something a little bit more very strictly narrative, something kind of short. And I think there were parts of The Dying Grass just being kind of out on the frontier, so to speak. Kind of wanted to stick with something in that vein. It was, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but it was
Instinctual.
yeah, we'll put it that way. Certainly not just because it was in arm's reach.
Sure, of course.
So,
All right, Tony, you're up.
So this past week, I read 2 books in full. I read Lemon by Kwon Yo-sun, which she's a Korean author, and it was translated by Janet Hong. Note that I got the translator there. Very, very short novel, kind of a murder mystery, I guess, but enjoyable. Very, very, very straightforward. Kind of had that slightly stilted style that I find a lot of Asian authors have, particularly Korean authors. But it had a kind of interesting narrative structure where the narrative switched not only perspectives from different characters, but also there was it was nonlinear, and there was no real definitive like markers for those things. So you kind of had to stay on your toes that way, but the language was very easy. Cool. I enjoyed it. I mean, it's not going to it didn't blow what little hair I have left back, but it was good. And then just this afternoon, I finished In a Lonely Place by Dorothy B. Hughes, which was a NYRB classic. I don't know if either of you guys are familiar with that one, but she was a fairly prominent crime and noir writer from the 40s and 50s. And In a Lonely Place was turned into a film starring Humphrey Bogart. And I guess to this day, it's very highly rated as a classic in the noir genre. I can't talk too much about it without spoiling the kind of premise, but I felt the writing was a little, in some spots it was spot on, and other spots it was very clunky. But the tone of the novel was excellent, and she nailed the kind of toxic masculinity and fragile male ego thing spot on. So some of the characters that are drawn out in the novel, I'm I've had this exact interaction with a person like this in real life. And I thought it was just very cleverly written in general. So that was great. And that was also quite short, 200 pages. I'm still chugging away at Che, A Revolutionary Life by John Lee Anderson. It's a great book. It's so unbelievably well researched, but the problem with a very authoritative biography like that is it can just become okay, this happened, but it's not super consequential to it's good that you know this for a fact that this went down, but it's not really part of a bigger narrative. So I need lots of breaks from that. And then I'm also reading another book in secret. So I read White Noise without telling Andy, and I have a whole list of books that Andy's been on my case to read for about 2 years now. So I decided that I'm going to slowly chip away at that, but I'm never going to tell him until I'm done. So I'm a third of the way through another Andy's top pick, but I'm not ready to disclose what that is yet. So I'm going to keep him on ice. So
oh boy,
hopefully I'll be done.
Is killing me.
Hopefully it'll be done by by next week. Because I do want to start with a pretty clean slate for when we dive into Lonesome Dove, which looks like it's the winner of the poll for our next book club pick. So,
A Western, I like it.
yeah, and I'll tell you what, I mean, I made a post on Instagram and TikTok just saying like, hey, out of these 4 Westerns, which one would you read? And there's like hundreds of comments of people just saying like, Lonesome Dove, it lives up to the hype. So we shall see. I'm really stressing out though. I was running a little behind schedule today because I went to Home Depot to buy a heat gun because we had like this little wave of humidity come through, and I think like the sudden shock of it, like a lot of my big books are like this, even though they were sitting on the shelf. And I used to not be too like precious about my books, but now I'm like, I don't know, I just have such a big book collection now, and so many of them are so nice that I'm like, I got to fix this. So I'm going to try to heat gun this out, and I don't know. Seth, do you have any experience with that?
Absolutely not. The 2 times I've tried to go extracurricular with repairing a book, I've done a real number on it. So I am not providing you any insights here.
Fair enough.
I left a book in my car once, and it just got so hot, and the glue like melted, and I went to open it, and the pages just fell right out.
Well, as it stands, there's probably about $300 worth of books on my shelf that now have severely warped spines. And look, of course, they're still very readable, but you know, I'd prefer if they looked nice too. So
it's one thing when the aesthetic damage comes from you reading it, and you know it's well read, it's worn, it's shown some character and some patina, but it's no fun when the elements do the work for you.
Yeah, exactly. And it sucks too because they're all like very uniformly like that. You know what I mean? It's not like they're kind of lopsided or something. They're all just like bowed in the middle.
Just a full sinusoidal wave working its way across your shelf.
Yeah, it's not pretty. We are now 30 minutes in, so let's get to the topic of today's discussion. It was a shocking moment for me, Seth, when you told me that you're not even sure postmodernism exists. Because I thought you were the postmodern poster boy, being such a Thomas Pynchon fan. So let's hear your opening statement, I guess, on the topic of postmodern literature. What is it, and should we care about it, and anything else you want to add?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, look, sort of the impetus behind this episode and why I'm here to chat with you guys is we really want to fixate on the use and, in my opinion, misuse of the term postmodernism in the booktube, bookstagram, book talk community. When I think about postmodernism, I think it's become something of there's a Latin term for it, membra disjecta. That is to say, scattered fragments of something that may have existed but have lost its meaning. And I think that the word is being used typically these days as kind of a shorthand for long, narratively complex, and generally difficult fiction. And length and difficulty often get conflated in that discussion. Kind of moving on from that idea, its formal techniques are often deployed as its definition, which I don't think make a definition. So people have said, oh, postmodernism, those are books that are, ironic, discontinuous, they're contradictory, they've got a lot of randomness and excess and whatnot. But again, those are the features of it. Those aren't necessarily its definition. And one of my major problems with it is there's a lot of definitional instability around postmodernism as opposed to something like modernism, which was very clearly delineated and consciously pre-planned. If you look at, I've got a couple of different people's definitions of postmodernism. John Barth called it the literature of replenishment. Charles Newman called it the literature of an inflationary economy. Jean-Francois Lyotard called it a general condition of knowledge in the contemporary informational regime. And Ihab Hassan called it a stage on the road of the spiritual unification of humankind. So we've got a lot of different ways that people are defining this. And I think what's rubbing me the wrong way about postmodernism is I'm not convinced anyone actually knows what it means. And if we don't have a meaning for it, why are we using it? That's kind of my entry point into why I thought I'd come on and chat with you guys. To that end, might hand it over to you for a moment for a couple of responses.
Andy, do you want to go first? Do you want me to take it from there?
I will just say I have to, I want to piggyback off that. I also have no idea what it means. And for that reason, I've kind of, I wouldn't say given up on using it or looking for books that fit in that vein. But I think, for me, when I first read Gravity's Rainbow, and that was my, as I've said before, kind of my entry point to this whole world of weird and obscure and potentially fucked up fiction. And, trying to like Google and read more about that and kind of learn more about it and understand it more and find more works like that. Like, postmodern, postmodernism, postmodern lit was one of those buzzwords that popped up almost everywhere I looked for it. And I had this idea in my head, like, okay, like I'll just read more postmodern literature and I'll tell people that I like postmodern literature because I'll seem smart and highfalutin and, very intellectual. And then the further I got into it, I realized like, I don't really know what this means. It's just kind of become a catch-all term. And it definitely anything that's long and or difficult are kind of the main characteristics it gets attached to. But anything, like you were saying, Seth, whether if there's irony, if there's some satire, if it just plays with it a little bit more than your standard novel, and it's more than 400 pages, it's boom, automatically postmodern. And to me, it's become, like I was just saying, watered down to the point of being just a buzzword on the cover blurb. That it's synonymous to me with ambitious and tour de force. Like it's just a marketing term at this point. And I've stopped. I wouldn't say I've stopped caring about it, but it's become much less of a central kind of guiding light for me and my tastes, my choices, how I approach what I'm reading. I try to focus on the novel at hand and the context it was written in, the context it's the book speaks about, and then anything else it might relate to directly or indirectly, without worrying about whether it's postmodern, modern, postmodern, new sincerity, post-structural, all of these things that, people just argue about to seem smart.
Hey, it's Editor Tony here. Sorry to interrupt the episode, but I wanted to ask you for a favor. You see, when I started making book content about 2 years ago, I really had no idea what I was doing or what the big plan for this whole project would be. But I've come to learn over the last 18 months or so that I can actually have a really positive impact on the reading community and the literature community. One of the comments I get almost all the time on our videos is, wow, I never see anybody making content about these books. And I take a lot of pride in making videos and other content pieces about books that just don't get the appreciation that they deserve. But in order for me to keep doing that and to take it to the next level, I do need your help. So if you like what we do here at Life on Books, I really encourage you to go check out our Patreon page. We're building an awesome community of readers over there, and I truly believe that with your support, we can make a big impact on promoting reading and great authors and artists. Thanks so much, and back to the episode. I think both of you brought up excellent points, and I would agree with most of what both of you said. Seth, I think it's an interesting distinction that describing something's elements is not the same as defining it. And what's interesting about that point is when I was kind of curating a little bit of content on the Patreon about postmodern lit, I was looking at postmodern, obviously literature, but also other forms of art. And on the Wikipedia page for postmodern music, they have some scholar who they cite, and he listed 15 or 20 different elements that make up postmodern music. And so that to approach it in that way then begs the question, well, how many of these boxes do you need to check to get it across that the goal of now it's in the realm of postmodern, and if you remove one of these elements, now it's back to not being postmodern. So I do think having a definition is more practical in some instances than just laying out a list of qualities or common elements that you'll find in a postmodern work. And I also agree with you that there is a misuse of the term, and it does seem like now anything that's basically weird is going to get that label slapped on it. But I do also think that there is a functional and practical reason for that to be that way, which is all labels and genres are really just markers for people to identify easily if they might enjoy this piece of art or not. So while I do really enjoy the intellectual discussion of like, should we have this discussion about, is this postmodern? Is it overused? What is it really? That's good. I also don't necessarily care that much if the term is a little overused, because again, if it helps people on that path, like we talked about the top of the episode, how we all kind of got here, I do think it is a little bit of that North Star, you know what I mean? That helps us get to these more interesting works. So the definitions that you referenced, Seth, were all quite interesting and a little esoteric, I guess, for lack of a better term. But do you have a definition for it yourself?
So that was another reason why I wanted to come onto this episode, was I don't want this to just be an exercise in tearing down something that people really admire and identify with. I want to see if between the three of us we can try to arrive at something like a fixed and stable sort of understanding of what it is. So there are a couple possibilities, but given the name postmodernism, it's in the name, it's a continuation of what came before it. And I think if you really want to discuss postmodernism, you actually need to look back at modernism, the thing that came before it.
I agree.
And that's a lot easier to define because that was a movement, if you want to call it that, that was very self-consciously planned. It was an intentional artistic collaboration that was assembled by Ezra Pound. And it's important to note that it was initially a poetic form, and it's found its way into literature by way of Pound's mentorship of prose writers, primarily James Joyce and Wyndham Lewis. And again, start points, end points, a little bit slippery here. I would say it starts around 1922, definitively, with the parallel publications of Ulysses and The Wasteland. And The Wasteland, by the way, should really be a two-author named poem, because yes, it was written by T.S. Eliot. I'm not sure if you've ever read the original draft of The Wasteland. It is a mess. It is all over the shop, and it's about 4 or 5 times the length of it in its finished version. It also had a different name. He do the police in different voices, which is a Dickens reference, I want to say. Anyway, not the point. Let's say 1922, give or take, around the sort of First World War. And to that point, I think that modernism was an ethical and an artistic response to the immense human cost of the First World War and this perceived decay and fragmentation of Western culture. You know, the promise of rational empiricism and progress and enlightenment and globalist unity were shattered, for want of a better word. And thus, the form that evolved in parallel with these ideals and rhetorical positions had to take a step backwards and reevaluate how the medium reflected their message. That's Marshall McLuhan for you. The medium is the message, right? Mm-hmm. So they, the modernists, they watched their conception of the Western world crumble right before their eyes. And that disillusionment, and this is an important distinction from postmodernism, is that they strove in earnest to create a new grand narrative or cohesive totality. And that's how you end up with these massive seminal works of art. I think The Cantos of Ezra Pound, Finnegan's Wake, The Making of Americans, Gertrude Stein, The Human Age by Wyndham Lewis. These are novels and poems that strive to create a new perception of reality. And I'll come back to why perception is an important word there. And it's to this end that you kind of end up with the dominant features of the modernist movement. So we're back at that discussion of features rather than a definition, which are a sweeping search for a grand narrative, imagism, which was kind of the earliest organized literary movement in English, this idea of how much meaning can you cram into a single word or phrase, metaphor, metonym, symbolism, structural experimentation and narrative voice, radical individualism, externalization of consciousness, stream of consciousness, that whole thing, right? That's kind of modernism in a nutshell. So what happened? When does modernism end and postmodernism begin? I'll branch to you guys in a second on that, but at very least we kind of need to think about this fulcrum point, and I think that postmodernism is useful insofar as it bears an inarguable chronological signpost. That is, it's fiction that is anchored to the Second World War and its associated fallout. I think your earliest possible starting point for postmodernism would be May 1939 when Finnegan's Wake was published. I think probably the latest you could say it started would be in June 1969 with the final publication of the last fragments of Pound's Cantos. But I think the clearest starting point would be August 1945 with the creation of the nuclear bomb. Before I go on too much of a larger tangent there, what do you guys think about those as time points to anchor this movement to?
I wholeheartedly agree. I had always kind of viewed postmodern as post-World War II. You kind of alluded to it with modernism, where how coming out of the horrors of World War I, there was an attempt from all of these artists to kind of come up with a more unified grand narrative of the world. And how I had always viewed postmodern in a sense was the kind of opposite of that. Post World War II, the horrors kind of redirecting everyone and kind of shifting them to thinking like, okay, we have to find our unified grand narrative to this is a mess. There is no unified grand narrative. Not necessarily that it was a, one for all, total free for all, figure it out yourself, choose your own adventure, but there wasn't this North Star that everyone was looking to and striving towards. Everyone was kind of on their own path, and based off what had been seen in World War II, it was not as easy to predict the outcomes of the future. And there was a lot more freedom and questioning that led to these artistic choices.
Yeah, Seth, I'm glad that you brought up World War I. And I think that a lot of people maybe don't necessarily associate changes in literary styles with wars, but there was a pretty major shift in the perception of war in World War I that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of. So things like artillery, automatic weapons, those had been around for a while, but there was never a really big major global conflict where those instruments were employed by both sides. And so going into World War I, a lot of the people that had these weapons were very used to using them on people who didn't have these weapons and steamrolling. And a lot of people, multiple bodies on both sides of World War I thought it was going to be over in weeks or months. They did not expect a multi-year conflict. And then for the first time, these more kind of developed nations were on the receiving end of automatic weapons fire and artillery. So there was a lot of people going into World War I as soldiers or the family members of soldiers, still having that kind of like nationalism, patriotism, war is glorious. I'm doing it for my country. This is a grand adventure. And then if they manage to survive the trench foot and the artillery fire, they came home with serious, unbelievable wounds, both physical and psychological. And so I do think that was a big part of why there was this cultural shift. Because, I mean, really, if you think about it, if you were on the receiving end of artillery fire prior to 1915, you were probably in a nation that was not developed enough or was too suppressed to be a writer and to write books, right? So it wasn't until that period that, you know, very literate people with the means to produce written works were coming home with shell shock, basically severe PTSD from artillery fire, which is probably the most terrifying thing in the world. You know, just these massive bombardments raining down on you. You don't know if it's going to hit you, where it's going to hit. It's unbelievably loud. It just offends all of your senses. So I do think that was kind of a big part of it. And then World War II was another one of those cultural shifts where that patriotism was kind of rekindled with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And, you know, prior to that, America had done a really great job of trying to stay on the outside. And then we had our reason to enter the war. And, you know, the narrative that we kind of get taught here, I don't know what it's like in Canada, which is where you attended high school, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, here it's like, oh, you know, Hitler was bad and kicking everyone's butt, and the Americans went over there and punched the Nazis in the face, and we're the heroes. And in the meantime, you know, we're interning Japanese Americans. The Allies are bombing Dresden, killing citizens there. Obviously, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. There's instances and accounts of Allied soldiers raping women, murdering people that aren't, you know, enemy soldiers. It's just all kinds of horrible horror stories that kind of get shuffled aside. So I do think that there was two major cultural shifts that had an impact on the art. I'm glad that you brought up Joyce and 39 as kind of maybe like the first example of postmodernism, because in the article I'd written, I listed him as a proto-postmodernist. I think, and this might just be a flaw of my own education, but you know, when I was studying English in high school and in college a little bit, we were always kind of taught, like I have this bias about modernism that it was kind of like, yeah, they were experimenting with the narrative structure and the language itself, but it still feels like they're playing inside some sort of bounds that postmodernism was able to get outside of. And maybe that's like best exemplified by something like magical realism, where there is this, I don't know if supernatural is the right way to put it, but there is this feeling to it that it goes beyond what we accept as the real, as reality. And postmodernism took that exploration of the narrative structure and then added that unreality to it, I guess. But then you had mentioned like there was this perception of reality that modernism itself was shifting. So maybe to your point, there is no postmodernism. Maybe it's all just an extension of what the modernists were doing.
Well, you sort of, there's a couple of things I need to respond to there. Let's try to remember all of them in order here. But one of the things is the slipperiness of who was involved and when it started and how it progressed. Because when you talk about modernism, you're really talking about, primarily from a Eurocentric perspective, about 10 people. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Hilda Doolittle, H.D., Marianne Moore, William Carlos Williams, Wyndham Lewis, Juna Barnes, Gertrude Stein. And they all knew each other, and they were all involved in some way or another in this community of people that kind of surrounded the Egoist magazine, Ezra Pound's pet project. I'm not going to turn this into a big pound celebration, but I do think without him, you don't get modernism as we understand it. Now, to be fair, I should also put Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner in there as well.
I was going to ask about Faulkner, yeah.
But they were
I was going to ask about Woolf, so.
No, they were, the thing is, they were modernists. They were taking some of what they were seeing in terms of the techniques that were evolving at the time, but they were outside of those community of people who were very insular and all knew each other and all collaborated in one way.
So they weren't part of the gang.
Yeah, the gang.
They didn't.
Exactly.
They didn't have a membership to Pound Town.
Yeah. Jesus Christ. Yeah, you got it. You got it. Absolutely. And of course, again, I mentioned this earlier, but that's a Eurocentric perspective because there was evolution outside of that clique, call it, in various parts of the world. You've got the boom writers who are using some of the same techniques, Fuentes, Lezama Lima, Donoso, Cortázar. You've got the French Aleppo group, so Raymond Queneau, George Perec, Italo Calvino. He wasn't French, I don't think, but he wrote with those guys. And then the peripheral modernists, people like Oguz Atay, the Turkish author, Bruno Schulz, Miklos Senkuthi, Knut Hamsun, etc. So there's a lot of things going on in parallel here. But what I want to get to is that central core group was something that was very self-consciously planned, which sort of begs the question, what happened? When did modernism end? When does postmodernism begin? Because this transition period, I don't think that modernism so much as ended as it did evolved into something else. I've seen a few people suggest this idea that maybe a more appropriate term for postmodernism would be neo-modernism. But again, I don't know how much we want to litigate something like that. But this leads into the trouble with defining it because it wasn't as intentionally organized. It had a more fluid, more organic formation, and its central figures, the people that we would all know, Pynchon and co., evolved somewhat independently from one another and then were brought together retroactively. I think of that moment, the postmodernist dinner organized by Donald Barthelme in 1983. Have you seen that photo?
I've heard of it.
I have, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But this is something that had been stewing for at least 30 years prior to that. One of the earliest known uses of the term postmodernism came from Charles Olson, the great, great poet of the Maximus poems. And he coined that term in 1951, I want to say, in a letter to Robert Creeley. So, you know, we've got a bit of a slippery time frame here, but let's go back to that subject of the wars, the First and the Second World War, which I think are critical if you want to understand. Let's kind of move on from modernism and into postmodernism now. There's a very simple heuristic, or I don't know, hermeneutic doorway that people have used, that modernism is before the bomb and postmodernism is after the bomb. It's a little bit, it's probably a little bit trite, a little bit simple, but I think there's a grain of truth to that particular reduction. And that's, the nuclear bomb fundamentally changed reality. And not just in the sense of war, it changed everything. Okay, the nuclear bomb is, at its core, an inverted star. It's taking the energy that's required to hold an atom together and tearing it apart. It is literally tearing the fabric of reality apart. And from it, every piece of technology that we recognize today shares in some way, shape, or form the connective tissue that originates from the research into the bomb. You look at the first general purpose electronic digital computers. They were initially used for ballistic calculations and nuclear research. Venture capital, prior to the Second World War, it was primarily wealthy families, J.P. Morgan, the Wallenbergs, the Rockefellers. Post-Second World War, it becomes private equity firms. The first was the ARDC, American Research and Development Corporation, and that was invested in applied physics, electronics, and nuclear technology. Then you've got the internet as it originates in ARPANET, surveillance, detection, interception technologies, SAGE, semi-automatic ground environment, interstellar travel, like, come on, Andy, you know Operation Paperclip. That's the center of gravity's rainbow right there, the solid-state circuit board. You cannot trace the modern technological landscape back to anything other than the nuclear bomb. And for that reason, I think the bomb is the thing that we could anchor this shift in artist thinking to. I think it's the thing that really changes the game for everyone. And this is going to lead me a little bit to what I think is a possible definition of postmodernism. but I am stealing it from someone else. It's Brian McHale's definition. He wrote a fantastic book, Postmodernist Fiction. I highly recommend it to anyone who's sort of interested in this discussion and wants to hear from someone who is not just, what did we call ourselves earlier? Meatheads, blabbermouths? Yeah, something like that.
Either or.
Yeah.
Brian McHale suggests that the transition between these two movements is a shift in dominance. And what I mean by that is modernist fiction is epistemologically dominant. How can I interpret this world that I'm a part of? What is knowledge? Who possesses it? How do they know it? With what degree of certainty? How is knowledge transmitted from one knower to another? What degree of liability? What are its limits, etc.? And I think kind of the high water marks of that would be sort of Finnegan's Wake and the Cantos of Pound. Postmodernist fiction is ontologically dominant. So that's focusing on reality. What is the world? What kind of worlds are there? How are they constructed? How do they differ? What happens when different worlds are placed in confrontation with one another and the boundaries of those worlds are violated? What is the mode of existence of a text? What's the mode of existence of the world? How is a projected world structured? This idea of the nuclear bomb tearing reality apart suggests to me that the artists of that era were forced to reckon with, okay, how do I create an art that reflects the suddenly torn apart reality that I live in? And I think that is potentially a useful heuristic when talking about postmodernist fiction. I'll hand it over to you because I've been talking for way too long now.
Andy?
Tony?
Andy's like, we're already in too deep. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, I think that is an excellent kind of example. The analogy, I guess, is the bomb. Obviously, unbelievable ethical implications, technological implications, that, for lack of a better term, I believe that the phrase is a Mexican standoff. We've reached that point now where it's like we're all kind of doing one of these like things, with all the other nations that now possess this technology.
Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, it goes way back. It happened relatively quickly. Listening to you describe it, I think it's one of the distinct factors about postmodern literature. I think when I was trying to get to this earlier, I just couldn't articulate it. Was that there's a lot, in my opinion, in postmodern literature that exists without needing to give the reader a catalyst or a reason for that thing happening. And maybe you could draw some type of parallel to the absolute chaos of what happens in an atom when it's split apart as being like that metaphor, right? Like there's things happen that we don't necessarily can understand or can draw a one-to-one conclusion to. And maybe that's like kind of like over the edge of reality thing that modernism just really didn't fully get to. It's interesting though, because the next kind of question for me is, if that is the case, if 1945 is the line in the sand, is it now postmodern simply because it happened after that date? And if that's the case, when, if at all, has postmodernism ended? And if it has ended, what are we calling all this weird literature we have now? And that's a question that I'm asking in earnest because I don't have anything to add about that.
Well, that's one of the central problems that I see with it, right? Is, okay, if everything that came after it is postmodernism, what is the utility of that definition at that point?
Sure.
And so by kind of putting this an idea, trying to group everything under the concept of being epistemologically versus ontologically dominant, I'm trying to create something of a schema that we can fit particular works of art in. Another way you could look at it, there's a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who describes this concept of what he calls totality and infinity. And totality is the concept of trying to fit everything. I'm simplifying here, but it's trying to fit everything into a rigid schema, a grand narrative, to use that term again. Infinity is embracing plurality and multiplicity and the incongruity of certain things to fit within certain hierarchies. It's deconstructing the grand narrative. And I think that is a key difference between the modernists and the postmodernists. Is the post group are extremely skeptical of anything that resembles a unified view of the world when we now live under this, we live on the grid, right? The text of postmodernism is Gravity's Rainbow, and that's a book that exists on the grid and is extremely skeptical of anyone who tries to create a narrative that says anything other than we are living in a period of complete atomic chaos. I heard someone refer to postmodernism once as nuclear modernism, which is an interesting concept again. But to your original point, Tony, I think that is one of the problems that we have with it is, all right, so maybe this is where it starts, but where does it end? Because I'm not about to start calling things postmodernism or postmodernism. It's just
that was something that Wallace was trying to grapple with, correct? Like, we're at this turning point. Things are starting to change again. What do we do with the postmodern works that led to this point in time? What do we call how do we define what we're doing right now? And if postmodernism was a breaking down and restructuring of the rules and the boundaries and exploring outside of those boundaries that were created by modernism, is whatever comes after postmodernism just going to be an inverse of that? Are we going to return to that more rigid or more defined structure? Or is it just going to continue expanding outwards and getting further and further away from this idea of reality, or whatever the hell you want to call just the human condition? What do we do now?
I'm glad you brought up the deconstruction of the grand narrative, Seth, because it's hard to have a discussion about postmodern literature without looking at kind of postmodern philosophy, culturally speaking. And this is a term that our buddy Jordan Peterson has kind of made very popular and made it a buzzword with a negative connotation for people that maybe are a little bit right-leaning in their politics. He's always, the postmodern neo-marxists. And but the bigger scale of postmodernism philosophically is the kind of idea that there is no grand narrative, right? Like, there is no one reality. And the reason why people push back against that is because it's very frightening, because it challenges their worldview, because it doesn't fit nice and neatly into a box. And so it's on its surface, it seems very mild, but to people who have their entire identity is anchored to the world has to work this way for me to stay sane, they're going to push back against postmodernism a lot. But the ironic thing about it is, it's like, we didn't want that. We didn't want, you guys dropped the bomb. We didn't do that. We're not the ones that changed the fabric of the universe with a weapon. Like, it wasn't like the people who are writing postmodern literature wanted to be in this scenario where there is no like unified reality for us, because it is chaotic, scary, overwhelming, potentially could be a breeding ground for evil and nefarious purposes and all these really serious implications. I'm not really trying to make any definitive statement about that, just kind of pointing out the irony of it. It's like people talk about postmodernism as it's like this dirty word, but it's like, you guys did this. Like, modernists didn't make postmodernism. It was an outcome of dropping a nuclear weapon.
Well, I think another thing as well is for that camp of people who rally against postmodernism because it violates their conception of the world or their fixed worldview. The sort of irony in that is that this is the literature that serves people who have had their conception of the world completely violated. Like, this is the form that expresses what it is to live under those conditions.
Right.
To bring it back to those key features, again, contradiction, discontinuity, randomness, excess, the short circuit. These are things that depict what it is to live on the knife's edge of a century in technological crisis, for want of a better word, like that Mexican standoff. That it's probably not a politically correct
no,
phrase
it's certainly not.
Yeah.
It's certainly not.
But hey, we're all friends here. It's fine.
I don't know. I don't know how else to describe it though. So
but it's a very good sort of simple encapsulation of what it is to live in that suspended state. And I think people should approach that type of literature with an open mind, because if you are terrified of having your conception of the world fractured, this is the artistic form that serves to capture what that feels like, basically.
Yeah.
And on the flip side of that, I almost struggle to read things that are more like, oh, let's tie everything in a neat little bow at the end and everybody will live happily ever after and we're going to neatly end the story, because I'm reading that. I'm like, but this isn't how it works anymore. There's no rhyme or reason. Things just happen and it doesn't make sense and it's weird and overwhelming and chaotic. And I want what I'm reading to encapsulate that feeling so that I can be more at peace at best and a little bit more understanding at worst. Like, and if it's just like, oh yeah, and we saved the day and we solved the mystery and we're all best friends and the real treasure was the friendship we made along the way. It's just like, but where's the actual reality in that anymore? Because that's just not how it works. And that's, I think, why I gravitate so much towards, these postmodern texts that we're trying to define today. It's because it really captures, like we've all been saying, that sense of foreboding and overwhelmed that it kind of is just what it feels like to be alive right now. Like I can go on my phone and within 30 seconds see actual real-time updates of young children and babies in the Middle East being slaughtered, and then scroll and 30 seconds later see someone just posting their "get ready with me" while they do their makeup to this week's trending pop song, all within the same minute in the palm of my hand. How does any of that make sense? And that's what I think is so profound about these types of literature and why they're so important. It's just because it captures the reality, so to speak, whether it's actually examining reality or playing with the rules of it and what reality actually is. Like you just get that anxiety and that chaos out of it that you can't experience in something that just plays along with this grand narrative of we're all supposed to end up here.
Well, it's an interesting point, Andy, because I think technology, the communications technology, has really demonstrated how there is no one constant reality all the time, right? And so speaking of the Middle East, I don't want to get too deep into that topic, but I saw somebody post a photo of an area near that region where life looked completely normal. And clearly there's some parts of that region where life is not very normal, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. And normally you wouldn't really have, prior to modern communications, you wouldn't really have that ability to see that juxtaposition, right? But now we are acutely aware of the fact that I can go out on my porch tomorrow morning and sip a cup of coffee on my deck and watch the sunrise in peace, and at the same time, like you said, in real time, pull up any number of horrors happening across the globe and watch it in near real time. So I think the means of communication technology really is is part of the postmodern experience because you can clearly see that there are multiple realities happening simultaneously. And Seth, I don't know, did you listen to our interview with Dr. Christoph Koch?
No, I haven't listened to that one yet.
So he's a neuroscientist, and his field of study is the conscious experience. And he basically said, like, reality basically for everyone is just what their experiences are. And so no two people's realities can be the same. Like, my experiences could be extremely similar to yours, but they're still fundamentally different. And I understand why people would push back against that, because it is kind of a hard thing to wrap your head around conceptually, and it's a little frightening anytime you try to tackle such a just an out there idea like that. But to kind of tone down the seriousness of the conversation mildly, I often make comparisons of literature or writing in books to music, and so. Thinking about like the time period of when postmodernism started and when, if it's ended, I think it's something like 70s music, like 70s rock. So at the time, a lot of these bands that were very popular, if you ask the fans of these bands, like, oh, is Led Zeppelin the same as Creedence Clearwater Revival? They'd be like, no, like not even close. But now, way into the future, we look back and sonically and tonally and thematically, that's all the same. That's like nicely contained for us, right? Like, as someone living in their 30s in 2024, like all that music on one playlist would fit very nicely together for me. You know, I'm not like it all kind of meshes, and so I do wonder if like. Maybe we're still in the middle of this postmodern movement, and it all seems a little like, oh, we can't define this, and this author's drastically different than that one. But maybe in 50 years, we look back and be like, oh no, there is a very clear line in the sand of when this ended. What do you guys think about that?
Well, most artistic movements and eras are defined in retrospect. Modernism was sort of an outlier insofar as it was something that was very consciously planned. So I think you're entirely on base there. I think we will look back maybe 50 years from now and say, oh yeah, that definitely ended, and then this started then. It's hard to say what that is now. There are still people writing today who are using a lot of the techniques that we would recognize from those kind of key postmodern figureheads. Pynchon, Gass, McElroy, Barthelme, Robert Cooper, like those are kind of the standard bearers that we think about. There are still people who are using those techniques and taking them to new and interesting ends. I think Vladimir Sorokin is one of those people. I think Will Self, Matthias Enard, Ian Sinclair, Laszlo Krasznahorkai, Evan Dara, whoever that actually is, Joshua Cohen, Vanessa Place. It's something where I think we won't know until we get there. So for the time being, we just got to kind of enjoy the ride as it goes.
I think part of it too is the way things change and drift apart so drastically. Like, I've talked about this kind of informally and not really in any sort of like literary sense, but I think it can tie back to it. Thinking about like characteristic changes from one generation to the other. Like, I think about it. I'm 28. I'll be 29 in the start of the new year. I have a much easier time. Tony, how old are you?
39.
Okay, so Tony's a decade older than me. I have a much easier time understanding and relating and communicating with Tony, who's a decade older than me, than I do with anyone that's a decade younger than me. And I'm sure you guys have similar experiences where like the overall changes, the big picture stuff, that the technology, how it affected our everyday lives, there were big shifts between my generations and Tony's, but they were not as drastic as the changes between my generation and whatever generation is after me. So there's the gap just gets wider. And I think that can be tied back into the literary sense. And these changes happen on a much grander scale and much quicker, much more rapidly. And you still have people like, for this analogy, like my generation and Tony's, who are active and involved and writing with these postmodern techniques and characteristics, but you also have so many other people that have risen up out of, the tail end of postmodernism and now have their own ideas. And then I think people are much more courageous now in the sense that, like, they'll see a novel that took the ideas of postmodernism and expanded on it and flipped it on its head and created its own new rule set. And then, so-and-so saw it on Instagram and read it and was like, oh, okay, I can do whatever the hell I want. I'm going to just take what this person did and just totally flip it and come up with something even crazier and more outlandish. And then it just continues this domino effect of more and more unique, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, and different styles that are at this point not really defined.
Well, maybe that is the end of postmodernism, because I don't necessarily get the sense that Thomas Pynchon was writing insane things that are hard to understand for their own sake. No. You know what I mean? So, like, if somebody is reading Pynchon and then being like, oh, all bets are off, I can do whatever I want, and I'm going to do something crazy just to be crazy, I think maybe that is beyond the limit of what postmodernism was doing. Because you read something like Gravity's Rainbow, and I mean, Seth, you've read it how many times now?
4, I think.
And I'm sure, there's still parts where you're like, I'm not super confident in what I'm reading, like,
I'll never fully understand that book. That's why
you'll never fully understand it. But I don't think Thomas Pynchon sat down and wrote, you know what, I'm going to try to write a book that nobody can fully understand. Like, I think he was writing something that he was still trying to convey what he was thinking and feeling at that time. So it wasn't zaniness for the sake of zaniness, you know what I mean? And I'm sure he probably had fun in some parts of what he was putting together, but it does feel like a very serious book to me, despite its lowbrow humor at times. It feels like a very serious book to me. So, yeah, maybe that's for me. I
didn't mean to say that like people are just going to write Gravity's Rainbow 2024 just to be zany and outlandish, but I think there's just going to be like shifts and changes and that we don't know how to define yet, and they're only going to get exponentially larger as time passes, as things in the world get more inexplicable and difficult to comprehend.
So the question for you fellas is postmodern literature a style, a genre, or a time period?
Yes.
Oh.
And I'll go back to music on this one. So, are you guys familiar with nu metal at all?
Like NU metal. Wasn't
Correct.
Linkin Park considered them that?
They were.
The early stuff, like Meteora?
Just like vaguely, in the sense that I know it exists.
Sure.
So, the history of metal in a very quick nutshell, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden kind of kicked things off. And then into the 80s, it became much more extreme. And that's when you had thrash metal, Slayer, early Pantera, Napalm Death, early Napalm Death. And then we shifted more into the glam metal, and grunge was a little bit of a response to that. And then nu metal was like an offshoot of grunge. So taking the kind of vibe of grunge, but moving it back into more of a metal, harder, more extreme scene. And that was also, so it was like mid 90s through like early 2000s. And there's some very common characteristics about nu metal. Again, like you can list out these elements, but is that a real definition, right? So typically not a lot of screaming vocals, more like yelling or singing or rapping. Like rap metal is kind of like a subgenre of nu metal. There was a lot of like DJing and synthetic sounds were a big part of it. So a lot of these bands had DJs and samples included, much more groovy and like rhythmic type of beats rather than like crazy punk or like thrash type of chaotic beats. Now there's a band that both of you are probably at least familiar with the name, Slipknot. Everyone says they're nu metal. And this is a hill that I will die on. They are not nu metal. But nobody knows where else to put them, right? Because they were in that exact time period. They toured with a lot of these same bands. But Slipknot had a lot of double bass drumming, which no other nu metal band really did. They had very, very, very limited rapping. There was basically no rapping. There's a little bit like sprinkles of it here and there, but it's not even, you can't even really call it rapping. A lot of screaming vocals. They did technically have a DJ, but you wouldn't even know because like the music is just so over the top and hard and heavy. And so I'm like, no, those guys are like proto, what we would call metalcore, but everyone just lumps them in with nu metal. And it's like, okay, then is nu metal a genre or is it a time period, right? Because just because they existed in this time period and toured with all these other bands, does that make them nu metal? And I kind of think of like, I question that about postmodern literature too. It's like, is something postmodern just because it existed in this time frame, or is it postmodern because it checks those stylistic boxes? And I guess it could be both. It doesn't have to be either or.
One of the things I take away from that sort of historical background on nu metal is this idea of the emergence of all these different forms and styles that came out of that sort of original precedent metal form. There's again, to use this word, a rhizomatic nature of it. For every node, 3 more grow out of it. And I think to a certain extent, you could consider postmodernism taking a similar lineage or pathway of development. It's germinal, it's fungal, it's growing outwards and expanding into a bunch of different directions at a time. And one of the salient sort of characteristics of postmodernism is chaos. So how do we define something that's chaotic? Well, this is just a weird little idea, but humor me. There's a principle in thermodynamics that suggests that chaos is just stability sped up, and stability is just chaos slowed down. So I think we're only really going to know what it is when we've had a long time to sit back and examine it, because things are moving really quickly and they're developing at a rate faster than we ever could have imagined. Again, back to the idea of the technological advancement that came out of the bomb. So I don't know if I can answer your question definitively, Tony. And again, does this lead me any differently to before this conversation? Can I define it? I don't know. There's a couple of possibilities like we've talked about. Do I value what came out of that period? Absolutely. Is it important? Is it worth talking about? 100%. Does it need a name? It's in the eye of the beholder, I guess.
Maybe, yeah. So
yeah, I think it could be one of those things where like you were just saying is that it needs more time to be fully defined. I think if you're just kind of looking at it from a bird's eye view, it could very easily be categorized as a time period. Just for easy markers, we'll say the dropping of the atomic bomb to sometime in the late 90s, whether we want to put a bookend on it with the publication of something like Infinite Jest or Underworld or one of the other, better known mega novels of that time period. And then everything that kind of came after is still trying to find its footing and not really defined yet. Or we were just talking about, we still have authors today that are publishing and putting out works that fit into the stylistic and thematic characteristics of a postmodern work, which takes away from it. Maybe it's not a time period. Maybe it is a genre. Maybe it's both. And if it is a time period, that time period hasn't ended yet. Like we were just saying, this might be much more of a clear answer 50 years from now, when there would be a hypothetical clear endpoint, and we can say, okay, postmodernism was from 1945 to 2030, and then this atrocity happened. World War III took place, and now everyone has this new perspective, and postmodernism is dead.
Well, I'm going to throw a wrench or a scary thought into all of this, which is the idea that these art movements, we'll just call them that broadly, are defined in some part by their time period. Again, communications technology is changing that. And I will again use music as an example. So there's this phenomenon, particularly on TikTok, but in a lot of different places, where young people are finding bands and music that is from generations prior. And that's not necessarily a new phenomenon. Like, there was always that one kid in school that, I was in high school in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was that one kid that was wearing like 80s bands t-shirts or 70s bands t-shirts. That's not necessarily new. But what's happening now is like kids are growing up only listening to a band that existed from 1990 to 2000. And now those kids are like starting bands that sound like those bands. And then, so there's I think Creed is an example of a band that's having this like mega resurgence. And I'm not talking like we're dusting off the tour bus and, we're just going to go play some shows to scrape some dollars together. I mean, they're like huge and doing these mega tours. And on the one hand, it's really great because now you're not necessarily being dictated to by only a few media sources of what type of art you can get into. I do kind of wonder, though, if it is a continuation of the fracturing of our culture, because now we are all becoming hyper individualized in our media and our art that we are consuming, which I hate to use that phrase, but where a lot of times, historically cultures were brought together by the arts, and now maybe we're all going into our own lanes too much, and maybe we're not quite there yet. But if we continue down this path, is it going to be too fractured?
We're all being defined by our Instagram algorithms.
Exactly.
But to that point, this idea that the young people are finding this this media, this content from a generation or multiple generations prior, that's old news. This idea of historical circularity is something that's been toyed around with for ages. I mentioned Finnegan's Wake earlier. That is a book that deals with, among many things, the idea that history is just a cyclic pattern of recurring archetypes. I think the story there is not the fact that young people are finding this old material, but the avenue, the mechanism with which they're finding it. TikTok, that algorithm is a terrifying piece of technology. This little line of code that has you figured out so quickly, so expediently, and so effectively by spending time with it. Someone needs to reckon with that, because that's something that could, if you want to talk unprecedented technology that change our relationship to the world, I think that's something that hasn't been fully reckoned with. I don't know if we have the tools to reckon with it yet, but the medium is the message there, and I would like to see someone deal with that. I don't know what it'll look like, but I'll be there for it.
I think that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, what comes after postmodernism, and also kind of ties into what I kind of said this off the cuff about how I'll see a reel with the catchy pop tune of the week. And I think that in and of itself is such a drastic change in how we consume media, particularly music and or audio. I'm sure we've all experienced this, where whether it's just a reel or something, a trend that has gone viral, or a new song has come out, and artists are now, not all of them, but a lot of them are releasing songs with the intent of it becoming trending audio on reels and TikToks, versus just a quality piece of music that will stand alone as a quality piece of music. And, I'll go on to Instagram tomorrow and see a reel that's got whatever song or trending audio, and I will come across that same snippet 18 times a day for the next week, and then never hear it again because it's been replaced by something else, because we all have the attention span of a bucket now and can't hold on to an idea for longer than 30 seconds. Well, and so, that's going to just further and further branching out from postmodernism, because maybe the medium and the avenue that this media is being shared isn't really changing, because it's, again, just trending audio after trending audio. But the particular media changes so frequently, and what is in and trending changes so frequently, that I can only imagine it's going to become the same thing with the ideas, the whatever is coming after postmodernism is probably already in the works. And then I don't know if that will have as long of a shelf life as postmodernism has, because everything is just changing so rapidly that it's probably only going to be a few cycles of doom scrolling until we get to the next atrocity that inspires the next literary and or artistic and or philosophical movement. I think it's just going to be too much change too quickly to really define anything.
Well, going back to what you said about Finnegan's Wake, Seth, and how generation, time is cyclical. Completely agree. However, I think my point is that, if we look at the rapidity at which it's happening because of social media, if chaos is just stability sped up, we have our foot on the gas pedal for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
And same thing like Andy was saying, things just turn over so quickly now. So that's, I guess, kind of another concern, kind of a slightly tangential, but you talked about the power of the algorithm. I've learned quite a bit about social media over the last 18 months. Obviously, it's part of why I've been able to kind of grow somewhat of a platform. But a misconception that people truly believe that the algorithm is designed, and this goes for all platforms, to serve them the content that they're most interested in. That is not true. The algorithm wants to give you the content that's going to keep you on the platform as long as possible. And that might not be something that you are quote unquote interested in. That is something that could emotionally just trigger you. And a very easy example is, you could go ask somebody who's very left leaning, do you like Donald Trump? They're going to say no. When you open up social media, do you want to see nothing but Donald Trump? They're going to be like, absolutely not. Well, guess what? A lot of those people, if you opened up their Instagram or their TikTok, guess what's going to be there? Donald Trump, Fox News, because that's the stuff where people are sitting there watching it because they get angry and they want to hear what this person's saying so they can tell them that they're wrong. They can comment, leave a nasty comment, or argue with people. And the algorithm is tracking all of that. They know if you watched the whole video, if you swiped away and then came back to it, if you wrote a comment and then deleted it and scrolled on, it knows it's tracking all of that stuff. So it's just serving you the thing that's going to keep you on the app. Now, if that's stuff that makes you angry and just makes your blood boil, then yeah, that's what's going to get served to you. So just a caveat, something for people to be aware of whenever they're using social media. You can just be conscious of your behaviors because the app is listening and watching. So
what you've just highlighted there is an essential postmodern experience. To bring it back to something, won't take us on too many more tangents here, but hear me out. Both of you have read Gravity's Rainbow. Do you recall the concept?
I've not read it in full. Caveat.
You haven't read it in full. Okay, yeah. Gotcha.
I've read about half.
Andy, do you recall the concept of Der Raketenstadt, the Rocket City?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the most crystalline, clear examples of the postmodern condition captured in a single work of art. This idea of the Rocket City, this global cabal or cartel of industrial capital that creates the very foundation of the ontological experience that you contend with on a daily basis. I think there's a formal predecessor to that in that kind of hinge point between modernism and postmodernism, which is William Burroughs. In his Nova trilogy, he talks about this thing called the reality studio. And his idea is that reality is a more or less continual scanning pattern. And what we accept as reality has actually been superimposed upon you by a controlling power, a power that is primarily oriented towards some sense of total control. That algorithm is the vehicle for that reality being fed to you, and the power that be is essentially global capital. You know,
we're 100% living in that world now. Yeah,
it wants you to spend time on that algorithm. It wants you to spend as much time on the platform as possible because it wants to sell you something. Ultimately, TikTok, the product is not the videos you see. The product is the ads. The videos are the thing that keep you watching the ads, right? I think what you've described is an essentially postmodern experience. Don't know where I was going with that, but hey.
I would actually say that you, the user, are the product.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere.
That's even more alarming.
That's
Yes. Okay. So here, I mean, this probably isn't news to either of you, but like, think of it this way. Facebook, Meta, TikTok, they make money when some business, large or small, pays them to get an ad in front of a user, right? Like, hey, Meta, I'm going to give you $100 a day to run an ad for my business to people who are scrolling Instagram. So you are the product that is being sold to the business, right? You're the product being sold to the advertiser. Your attention is being sold to the advertiser. So you give, Meta receives the dollars from the customer, which is the business, and the product they are sold is you, the attention. So we are actually, as users of these apps, we are the products. Is it morbid,
upsetting and terrifying.
Yeah,
thought.
But it's mm-hmm. I've yet to hear a compelling argument against that concept.
I don't think
because I don't have one.
You nailed it. Yeah.
So let's try to land this plane if we can. It's getting late into the Saturday evening, and I'm sure Seth wants to enjoy his day in the future in Australia, as it is Sunday morning there. So let's all put. We'll do another Mexican standoff, put guns to each other's heads here. And I looked it up, and it is the history of the Mexican standoff. It's debated whether it's an offensive term or not. So if it is offensive, okay. I apologize. I didn't know what else to call it, but it's not a phrase that's necessarily tied to a negative connotation of Mexican culture.
We're using it in good faith.
Yes, we're using it in good faith. Exactly.
I have a Mexican friend. I can say it.
Oh, so let's all give our final definition of postmodernism, and then one book that's not Gravity's Rainbow. We can't. That's off limits because that's an obvious. It's low hanging fruit. So your definition of what postmodern literature is, and one book that you think defines postmodern literature that is not Gravity's Rainbow.
postmodernism is the poetics of a reality deconstructed. And for my pick, I would suggest 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, translated by Natasha Wimmer. And I think the thing that makes that novel work is the inclusion of part 4, the part about the crimes. Because what that novel is a navel-gazing, academic, masturbatory exercise superimposed over this penumbra of profound darkness, which that curated sense of reality has taken no time whatsoever to grapple with. I think there is a deeply disturbing thread of comedy in that book that does not get grappled with nearly enough. That's my pick.
All right. Andy.
I would say postmodernism to me is a breaking down and examination of the boundaries and or structures of reality to try and better understand the chaos that encapsulates us all. And I think for me, the book that I would probably pick that at least gets at the day-to-day chaos, maybe not so much of the grand consequential chaos as something like Gravity's Rainbow, but just the day in and day out chaos of the human condition. I would probably pick JR by William Gaddis. That would be my, I said this last year on the show when I read it and probably maybe it was during like our year-end recap. I don't have a single week at work or just in my life in general where I don't experience a moment of my day that couldn't have been lifted right from that novel, where like I'll be sitting at my desk talking to a coworker, and talking about work or something personal, whatever. A third coworker will come in, interrupt, and either add or change the direction of the conversation. My desk phone will ring. I will be interrupted from that conversation and start a new one and have the background noise of the first conversation interrupt my telephone conversation. And then someone else will come into the room on their phone with a customer or someone, and there will be 3+ conversations happening at one time. And it is just an influx of noise and information, and trying to find my center in that and reconciling with the fact that my reality is the conversation I'm having on the phone, but the reality of the guy next to me is the conversation he's having about his fantasy football team. And those two realities overlapping and trying to make sense of that overlap. So I think for me, barring Gravity's Rainbow, JR is probably the quintessential postmodern text, at least based on my definition of it.
But Andy, to that end, if you're fixated on this idea of realities overlapping and making sense of the noise, I just have one question for you, which is, hey, are you listening?
My man.
Tony, you're up.
You'll get that reference eventually, Tony. We'll explain the joke when you're older.
Love it. So I would define postmodern literature as a literary movement beginning sometime around the end of the Second World War that strives to get a reader to experience the chaos of a fractured reality rather than explain it to them.
I like that. I like that. That is a good one. Yeah, no, this is good. All right. He's landed the plane. What's your book then?
For my book, I'm not nearly as deeply read as you two in books that are even remotely adjacent or in what we would call postmodernism. But I think I would probably pick Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut for a couple
I would
reasons.
have bet my life that you were going to pick Catch-22.
That's what I thought he was going to say too.
Too cliche, you know. I hate to be cliche. So, no, I mean,
You have to subvert expectations.
exactly. It's very postmodern of me, but I mean, Catch-22 is a fantastic book, and I do consider it a work of postmodern literature. But I think I want to call out Slaughterhouse-Five because I think it does contain a few more of the elements that we would typically ascribe to postmodern lit, and I do think that there's a higher chance of somebody listening to this and picking up that book because it's shorter. Vonnegut's a little bit more of a household name, and so I do want to encourage people to engage with this type of art. So that's going to be my pick, and I definitely do think that book fits the definition that I just came up with for what postmodernism is. And thank God this is being recorded because I want to write that down. So any closing thoughts before we at least click the unrecord button here?
Well, I'm glad you ended on the suggestion of a book that's very vulnerable and very human in its surrender to the conditions of that chaos. You've got that immortal line, "So it goes." That captures the essence of that novel and the ethos of Vonnegut's position so well. So I think that's a great one to close it off on, Tony.
Cool. And Seth, if people want to join you in taking trips down memory lane to Pound Town, where can they find you?
Oh, dear Lord. Yeah. Waste mailing list mostly everywhere except Twitter, which has a character count. So I think that one's just waste mailing. But WASTE mailing list. You can find me most places on the internet there.
And before we
YouTube.
log off, do you want to explain the reference to people?
Go. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Fair enough. The very first book I mentioned in this episode, The Crying of Lot 49. Go read that. Discover it for yourself.
Fair enough. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much, and you'll see us next time.